This is not the title that Gregor thought I was going to have up on the stage, in part because I have two projects that I do at kind of ongoing. I have a very large automotive project on transformation of the automotive industry, the role of public policy and unions and workers within that. And I did think about, I did have a whole presentation prepared for on that subject. However, it dawned on me that when we think about how do social actors construct their economies, their communities, what are the challenges, that in fact, perhaps more interesting research was some research I had the opportunity to do at the university. In my capacity as dean, I was asked by my provost to do a study of gender inclusion of faculty on campus, their experience of inclusion, and what needed to change in order for those women, me, but all the women faculty, to feel included in their workplace, and what was their experience in the workplace. So I decided instead to draw on those themes to talk a little bit about both the challenges but also the opportunities. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to change my glasses. Sorry. Sorry, when you wear bifocals, if any of you do, there is a mid-distance that you can't see, and that's always the distance I need in making presentations. Typical. Okay, and to some extent, this is a story of hope, but it's also a story about challenges of some of the existing social institutions of work that represent women at work. And I really want to talk about a subset of issues, and that is the struggles women engage in to construct a labor market and a community at work in which they always feel a sense of decency and respect, safety, and some degree of equality. How our unions and other social actors are not always, they should be the first point of call to change these issues, but in fact often they are not, and why this is problematic, not just for social actors and their role in society, but also for women's struggles for equality. So, I want to do this by introducing you to three stories, kind of vignettes. The one on our left, and I'll explain to international audiences, huge scandal in Canada when a CBC radio host, Canada Broadcasting Corporation radio host, kind of had become the icon of the new age of CBC, young, suave, sophisticated, loads of followers on Twitter, smart, left-wing, no less in his politics. He had created himself as a cultural icon with thousands of followers. The shock came when he was charged with sexual assault and harassment after several women came forward to lay charges against him for violence. These women were only a handful of the hundreds, including students who had worked with him, who experienced unwanted sexual attention, sexual harassment within a workplace, often violent attention from him. He used his media power both to access those women, and he used his media power to exploit those women, all in the context of a workplace. He created a hostile work environment for women who were fearful to come to work, but as many of you know, the restructured media in labor market has become so incredibly precarious and so difficult for people to enter into this work that many of them told stories of, well, I wanted to keep my job, I wanted a promotion, or this is my field, I love working in radio. So the trade-off was to put up with this. The questions I will want to explore is, where was the human resources of the corporation? Where was the union? And as you can imagine, Ghomeshi belongs to the same union as the women, some of the women that he was harassing at work. The second person, maybe less well known, but nonetheless to me was such a story of courage, a woman named Shauna Hunt. Again, she was a sports reporter, or is a sports reporter, who after many, many times at sporting events experiencing sexual harassment, kind of abusive language, she finally, at a sporting event, called out one of her hecklers, who shouted into and was laughing, thought it was hilarious to tell her the most vile, obnoxious kind of comments about her. And what she did was she actually asked him to repeat this to her mic. And the young man, feeling incredibly empowered, of course repeated the comments because he said he thought it was so funny. It was hilarious to harass, to denigrate this woman reporter because it was part of a culture that he thought was acceptable. What's remarkable is that, or perhaps makes one hope, is that in fact both his employment, we'll see how that turns out, he was fired from his job for shaming his employer. I'm not sure that that will hold up in a court of law. But also, she herself is protected by a union. But so far, we don't know what role unions will play in this. Finally, the last one, really, I'm trying to capture what became known as, it is a gender equity report I wrote, did some research with. Amanda Coles worked with me on this. A gender equity report on faculty members at McMaster University. And what was remarkable was there was a study done 25 years ago at McMaster about women at work. And what was incredible was the number of themes that reappeared 25 years later. We've made some enormous progress. There were way more women faculty, many more women full professors such as myself. So we've made enormous progress, but there were still some persistent issues. And there was a core of 25% of women faculty that consistently felt excluded from informal networks of power, with lack of recognition for their research, arguing that they did not take parental leave, even though it's a legal right, because they felt that it would jeopardize their chances of success, of recognition within the workplace. Interesting, complaints by men that they attempted to take parental leave, but it was made very clear to them that if they did, it would jeopardize their recognition and their career within the university. So what do these stories have in common? Well, they're all about workplaces and conditions of work, because even though in some ways very different, they're all about work. They're also stories about systemic harassment or exclusion of women in the workplace, but it also gives us insight into their everyday experience at work and within the economy. All these workplaces are unionized. Well, McMaster isn't quite unionized. It is a faculty association that bargains. And there are, as John Holmes and I have chatted about, there are differences in that. In two of these cases, the bulk of the workers are involved in work that is precarious. It's professional, but it is still precarious. And finally, the issues raised in these incidences have almost nothing to do with wages and benefits. Yes, albeit my report did do some work on wage inequality and very happily resulted in a significant wage increase across the board for all women faculty at McMaster. But so they all are about other things than the core of wages and benefits. They also have in common their origins outside the standard institutions of work, employment, and the labor market. None of these issues, none of these examples were channeled primarily through the union or through the other institutions of work. They attempted, we'll talk about in a bit, how CBC, the women attempted to use the HR department to channel their demands, but unsuccessfully. So the standard institutions of work, employment, and the labor market that many of us study were in fact absent or in fact blockages here. So we find in the Ghomeshi case, the women went to the HR, they went there to make complaints, but because of Ghomeshi's star power, because CBC needed the revenue that he generated, they would advise women, can't you find a way of working around it? Can't you find a way of ignoring it? Maybe you could look for another job. Anything but dealing with Ghomeshi the star himself. What's interesting about the story of Shauna Hunt, the reporter, is that she did not address this primarily through her union. In fact, it was more of a spontaneous opportunity, if you will. She reached the point where she was sick of doing her job and being heckled every time she did it. And in speaking to other women's sports reporters, a field in which women are just breaking into, the remarkable consistency with their stories that they just have to put up with the fact that the fans consistently heckle them, sexually abuse them, and so on. Often not just verbally, but physically as well. So in that sense, again, the standard institutions of work were not present. And finally, in my case, yes, kind of the standard institutions of work, but somewhat episodic, if you will. The challenge of women and inequality on campus did not primarily generate from our association, nor did it really generated from, there were a number of women on campus who kept pressing for some kind of study, some kind of understanding of what was the experience of inequality. Now, what's also interesting about these cases, and I think provides us with some elements of hope, but also leads us into thinking about, I suppose, the transformation of institutions and the role of social actors in transforming our economy and society and community. Many of these women used alternative strategies for challenging the sexualization of their work, which, thank you, Caitlin, if you're here, for the wonderful paper you presented yesterday on the restaurant workers, and to Louise Bovin for her work. Wonderful, wonderful panel, which really opened up this debate. So they use lawsuits. So we can think of a number of ways in which women use the law, or lawsuits, in the case of Ghomeshi, in the case of, if you think, there's a very famous academic, Marjorie Cohen in Canada, who took on the whole research enterprise in order to fight the fact that there were no women senior research chairs in Canada. So that kind of legal fight is outside the norms. I would also argue there's an element of the revenge of social media. Because while GM Ghomeshi used social media to build his profile and to build the cult of GM, women also turned to social media to name their stories, to tell their stories about their experience. It is remarkable, as the press started to dig into it, the number of student groups that had social media sites about GM Ghomeshi. Don't go work at CBC as an intern for him because you will experience sexual harassment. The use of social media to form collectives amongst women to resist these practices, or at least to avoid them, if nothing else. And I would argue there's an interesting element of discursive strategies around, oddly enough, the family and the household. And I'm not sure how I feel about this, and it's not something I've done extensive research on, but there's a way in which many times the response, in order to galvanize support for men around the demands of sexism, sexual harassment, there's an appeal to, would you want your mother, your sister, your daughter to be spoken in this way? So in this thing, discursive strategies based on family-household relations meant to engage and mobilize men behind these. Many of the women in these cases use their individual star power as a position of power. So in the GM Ghomeshi case, the women that actually came forward to lodge legal and have been part of now a criminal case, it was in part led by an actress, Lucy Decouteur from Trailer Park Boys, because she had the courage to speak out in public. Her speaking out in public as a star allowed other women to be able to add their names to that. And finally, in some cases, there is an element of some leaders got the problem. I've got to say that in my institution, I felt like women in leadership positions made a difference to opening up that debate around gender equity, inclusion, and the sexualized environment of work. So I would argue, though, that in many cases, these strategies, while they've been effective, they're not necessarily sustainable to transform our economy and community. And they are not sustainable because they're not institutionalized. That in fact, they rely on the social networks, which are highly fluid. They rely on often individual and timely moments in perfect timing. They rely on individual timely, seizing the moment, or reacting. In the case of Shauna Hunt, I think she thought enough is enough. And the fact that the young man was stupid enough to repeat his comments into a mic that was then broadcast worldwide, good on her for taking that on. But in this way, women are engaged in a form of disorganized resistance. It's episodic. It's not, there's this, and this is troubling because it means it's harder to sustain change or to lead to sustainable change. Moreover, women are forced to rely on circumstance, those moments when you can exploit the circumstance to highlight what is a deeply ingrained systemic process, but we can't seem to dig ourselves out of. So I would suggest to you then that this opens up a discussion about how key institutions of the labor market, of the economy, social actors need to change. Unions, I would argue, need to figure out how to change their practices, their representational practices and their leadership practices. Sexualization of work, sexual harassment, is incredibly complicated to deal with when you have a membership that is often male and female, and often the harassment is going on between two members of the same union. All unions know these are very difficult, thorny problems to deal with. But nonetheless, we need to think about this. I was so thrilled that Pierre Hall introduced the issue of women's training, just the recognition that women and men are different at work. We are not because, for any essential reason, but because the social construction of our engagement with work and our relationship to society and social reproduction is so different that, in fact, it changes everything we do at work. And therefore, unions need to expand their notion of who is the worker and what are those issues at work that need to be addressed. Human resource management and practices need to change. We talk about managers being important social actors. They are incredibly important social actors, but somehow we need to transform how they operate so that they are policy-based, so that they address workplace cultures, bullying, and so that there is a resistance to a kind of fear factor in HR of either of management without recognizing the kind of sexualization of work. I think some of the institutions that have changed, that are beneficial, is we've seen a change in the media. I would argue the media is a social institution, and it's become more so since we're accessing so many different points of media. Here, through media, the important thing for women is telling stories, telling their story of their experience at work, telling stories of resistance as well. And finally, I am going to make a kind of small, it's somewhat point, and that would say, I would argue as well, women have an incredibly important role to play in leadership in key institutions. I do think that feminist leadership within our institutions can be transformative. And that I think unless we engage in those kinds of activities, that in fact we may not be able to seize the moments to institutionalize some of the changes. And let me say a little positive story coming out of this, and that is that 2 years ago, and I will end on this story, 2 years ago I was asked to do, or a year and a half ago, to do this report. Did a massive survey of faculty and looked at women in leadership positions, and really didn't know, I wasn't altogether hopeful that whatever I did on this report would really resonate or be picked up by the institution. Because what was remarkable was that there had been change, but there were some pretty deep systemic problems. What's remarkable is, since the release of that report, we have now just about got a new parental leave policy, which is far ahead in terms of recognizing the time needed in recognition of the impact on families, women and men, of childcare and of raising children, that in fact sometimes it's not, well, from my experience, it's not the first 4 months when the baby sleeps, it's the next 13 years when they're teenagers and children and, so a new parental leave policy Remarkably, we have a new harassment policy at the very same time at McMaster, which is trying to really dig at how do we deal with harassment issues so that we protect both the person who's declaring their harassment, but also make sure that the institutional processes protect both parties. And of course, we've had a massive pay adjustment. I must say I was gobsmacked, I'm not sure how you translate that into French, when my report had shown there were systemic pay inequities between women. And one day, my provost said, okay, every woman is going to get a flat increase of $3,500, effective immediately in their base pay. So it tells me that playing these roles, and this is for me the transformation, social actors at work, transforming labor markets, the communities, and the work communities in which we live. Thank you.